In this video, I'm going to provide facts and data around what we know regarding the Potomic crash now days after it has occurred. The crash between the American Airlines Flight 5342 and the Blackhawk helicopter. I'll provide you the latest updates on this. And we'll also go through the Philadelphia crash to provide updates that we now have on the crash. We'll also give you my opinion as well as facts and data on where there are problems in aviation. I want to be really clear about this, and I think it gives me a unique perspective. I'm a newer pilot. I began my flight training in November of 2024. I am a licensed pilot, and I'm going through my instrument ratings and my multi-engine ratings to soon get typed to fly a small jet. Now, the reason I say I have a unique perspective here is because I've gone through training in 2024 and 2025, and I see the holes in our training that I think everybody involved in the aviation community should be aware of, because as a more experienced pilot, you might not be aware of the problems that are happening at the training level, which I think are really likely to compound into more aviation accidents in the long term. And so therefore, my goal in making this video is to try to provide facts where they're available, but then also some opinion on where I see problems that I think could manifest into larger issues. So I'll be clear, I've got about 500 landings under my belt, so 500 takeoffs and lands, in about 150 hours of flight time. So relatively new pilot, but again, I think that provides me an interesting perspective. So let's get started first by talking about what happened with this American Airlines versus Blackhawk crash, or Blackhawk crashing into the American Airlines flight. And the first thing that I want to say is most folks think that takeoff is the most dangerous phase of flight. And I know that. When I was not a pilot, I would always freak out during takeoff. I'm like, oh my gosh, takeoff, this is scary, like we're going higher. As a pilot, I've actually found that takeoff is generally relatively easy. And this becomes very important, as you'll see in just a moment, regarding the Potomic crash in DC. See, statistically, 53% of aviation accidents that occur during landing. Only 8.5% of aviation accidents occur during takeoff, which makes takeoff 6 times less risky than landing. Or put another way, landing is 6 times more risky. Now, there are many factors for this. Landing is, quite frankly, let's start with this way. You're setting up for a landing in the air, whereas you're setting up for a takeoff on the ground. If you need more time, you just sit on the ground a little bit more. That already changes the workload substantially, because you're getting your weather briefing and your clearances and your flight plates for your approaches or departures. You're getting all of that on the ground. You're able to prepare and stay ahead of the aircraft on the ground. The landing phase of flight, most of that work is done in the air. And if you started a little late on that and you got a little bit behind the aircraft, things compound very, very quickly during the landing phase. It is probably the most important phase to have a sterile cockpit, to not talk about anything else or focus on anything other than getting that landing done. And that's usually because you're dealing with a new environment, new weather briefing, new air traffic controllers, new traffic. It's one thing when you're taking off and you're looking at traffic on your iPad or your glass cockpit and you're like, all right, I see where traffic is. And you take off and you know what to pay attention to. When you're landing, everything is new and fresh. And that's probably why landings are indeed much more risky. But take a look at this. This is a helicopter route sheet, or it's basically the sectional plate for helicopters. A shout out to Bronco Leary for pointing out that the helicopter appeared to be on Route 1 to Route 4, likely Route 4 here. And you'll see that this intersects with Route 6 right here at the Ronald Reagan Washington International Airport, DCA. Now, something to know is you'll actually see Route 6 for the helicopter route goes right over the center of the airport. Now, a lot of people, I know me, before I was a pilot, I'd looked at that, I'm like, oh my gosh, you want me to fly over the airport? What? Interestingly, flying over the airport is relatively safe if you do it at the correct altitude. Because if you think about it, at an airport, aircraft are either landing or they're departing. So they are at their lowest elevation. And I think that's why over here you have a helicopter route that's like, look, 1,500. That's where you have to be. No lower, no higher. Now understand when you look at these charts here, these bars above and below the numbers, those are your ceilings or your floors. Those become very, very important, but they can be very confusing. Look how many of them there are. Here on this route, you're gonna go from 700 as a ceiling, so no higher than 700 as a helicopter, to 500, to 300. Over here, I see a 200, which looks like it's part of Route 1. Over here on Route 4, I see a 200 all the way down here, but I see a 1,500 over here and a 300. There are a lot of numbers going on here. And so to keep up to date with this in flight is very complicated. And I'm not trying to provide excuses. I'm simply trying to say it's overwhelming. You have to be very, very familiar with these routes. Look at the description for Route 1. At the American Legion Bridge, you need to be at or below 1,300, mean sea level. At another bridge, you need to be at 700. At another bridge, you need to be below 300. At the Memorial Bridge, you need to be at or below 200. At James Creek, you have to be at or below 300. Like, holy smokes. You need to know the names of all these bridges. You need to know exactly what altitude you need to be at these various different points. And this is the point of training. Here's that Route 4, which basically says you're going to start at 1,000 feet at Fort Washington, then you're going to descend to 1,600. Then once you have, off to your side, they call this a beam, the Broad Creek Inlet, well, good luck seeing this at night, you need to descend to 600 feet once you're abeam this, and then you're going to descend from 600 feet to 300 feet over the Wilson Bridge, and then north of the Wilson Bridge, you need to be at or below 200 feet. So, and then you'll intercept Route 1. So basically, Route 4 intercepts Route 1, which is just a way of saying as you're traveling up here, you need to go from 1,000 to 600. So you can see this here. Like, with more familiar, you see there's the fort. You can see the picture of it. See, there's the creek, the inlet. Okay, from 1,000 to 600. Okay, got it. We're going this way. Going to go down to 300. And then when you're north of this, you need to be under 200. Okay, well, now remember, they came down this way on the 1 portion. So they're traveling south towards Route 4. This is where you see you got to be under 300 here. You got to be under 200. But what we now know from the data is that it appears the accident occurred around 300 feet. Now, why do I say appears around 300 feet? It's because radar data shows the impact happening when both the aircraft, the airplane, the American Airlines Flight 5342, and the helicopter showed their radar at 300 feet. Now, that clearly indicates that the helicopter was too high. Now, what we know is radar rounds off to the 100 feet, which is really not a problem when you're an aircraft flying, over 600 feet. But when you're trying to stay below 300 or below 200, rounding to the tune of 100 feet is massive. That's like 50 to 30, 33 to 50% of your altitude is a rounding error. That's a problem. Radar should be much more sensitive at these lower altitudes, especially close to an airport. But unfortunately, our airports are not in the greatest shape. In fact, this is going to be one of my complaints in my opinion section, is where I talk about, why is it that landing equipment is so variable at different airports? A lot of it is either out of service or broken, or runways are in poor condition. The funding for our airports hasn't been great. And this is where I understand why people say, oh my gosh, we're spending so much money in foreign aid, we need to fix our own freaking airports. Well, yeah, we do need to fix our own airports, and this is not to make a political opinion, but there's a lot of fixing to do at our own airports. But anyway, this rounding of radar data is very, very bad when the difference of 100 feet, which is a rounding error, is literally the difference between life or death. Because if it is true that the helicopter indeed busted the ceiling right here of 200 feet, which it appears it did, then yes, it appears that the helicopter is likely responsible for the crash. Yes, we already believe, and that's speculation. I want to be clear about that. I'm not trying to point fingers here. We've got a lot to talk about on this. Here's, I think, AI Tally did a nice sort of 3D animation of this. I will say the first part of their animation I disagree with, so because it doesn't line it up like this. I think this is a good alignment of what likely happened, except it doesn't show you the vertical as well, because I really think this plane essentially descended and the helicopter was ascending, right? So you've got I'll picture that as the descending plane, the ascending helicopter, and that's how you get that sort of impact. It's a little hard, but this is probably one of the better 3D renderings I've seen of it. And busting that 200 is what created this. Now, these routes have since been canceled because they're just too close, too tight, probably because of the limitations of what we have over here. And there are other factors at play as well. The New York Times had a piece on this, and it essentially overlays what it sort of looked like to see the other plane. Now, I don't 100% agree with this because the plane would have had some form of positioning and strobe lights on in this angle, likely the landing light as well. But that would have blended in with city lights in the background. So this is not the best representation, I believe, but it's still decent to show you the windows and the positioning of, you know, how small objects look, especially when they're moving towards each other, especially if you're wearing night vision goggles and you only have, you know, a 40% sort of reduced field of view. I believe that at the point of impact, the plane was essentially off to the left here of the cockpit view. And if they were wearing night vision goggles, it's not an excuse, but it is likely that they just didn't see the plane that was landing over them. And yes, there was a likely misidentification. That appears to be the mainstream thesis right now, is that there was a misidentification, that they looked at the wrong American Airlines flight, a flight that was taking off, to verify that they were going to maintain verbal or visual separation, as the air traffic controller requested, and they requested from the air traffic controller, and the air traffic controller confirmed. They likely had the wrong plane in sight, and that's why this accident occurred. Now, that part is speculation. We believe that is a possible or plausible explanation, but it's speculation. Just like all of these diagrams are really just speculation. Well, all we know is that radar data rounds to 100, and it rounded to 100 in a place where 100 made a life or death impact. And that's what pisses me off, is why do we not have the technology to bring that tighter? Now, another thing I will say is that a lot of military aircraft, and this is my opinion, a lot of military aircraft I see do not transpond on ADS-B. Now, they can still show up as a data point on your map, so to speak. For example, I'll show you my iPad right here. This is a screenshot I took just the other day over the Camarillo Airport. This is what air traffic looks like for pilots when they use an app like ForeFlight. I could clearly see the November numbers for each of the aircraft. I could see their trajectory extended via these trend lines. I could click on them and see their recent path. That's sort of the green path that you could see there. There's a lot of data you could get. And so if I'm coming in for a landing, I could see which aircraft are in front of me. Now, something that bugs me is if you're not transponding on your ADS-B out, then you don't actually show up as an arrow or a triangle, which is ridiculous. In fact, over the Camarillo airspace, we have Point Mugu Air Force Base, a facility where we regularly have flight training, F-16s, we have radar planes, C-130s, they're all taking off over there. A lot of them are not actually on this map because they're flying dark. I saw a radar plane probably about 1,800 feet just southeast of the airport, maybe 3 miles southeast of the airport under the grade. And I'm watching it. I see it right in front of me as I'm in the left downwind for 2-6 over here. And they don't show up at all on my map. I think that's wrong. I think if military aircraft are going to fly in America on training missions, they should absolutely be required to show up and transmit ADS-B out data. So that way other aircraft could see their positioning. Now, I do not know if that was a factor here. There is another way you could show up as an arrow, and that's when an airport radar or a radar station picks up the aircraft and then transmits that radar signal to aircraft, which then we can receive, and then it'll show up as an unknown type aircraft, and we'll still get an arrow of it. But oftentimes I see these military aircraft, and they're just invisible. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. How am I supposed to feel safe flying when I'm looking at this for my traffic, and then military aircraft are flying blind. I think, as a newer pilot, that is very bad. I don't know if that played a role in this accident here, but I think there's a chance it could have. If that heli did not show up on this sort of traffic map for the American Airlines flight, they were scammed. They were scammed out of the data that could have saved 67 lives. Now, it's worth noting that according to the flight data recorder, the NTSB indicated that there was some form of audible indication 1 second before impact. It was probably something like, holy sh-, and they immediately pulled up. So the American Airlines flight saw the helicopter last second, literally the last second, and began a pull up, but it was too late. So clearly, the American Airlines flight had no idea the helicopter was there. Now, maybe they weren't looking at this transponder data, but my guess is that military flight was invisible, because I have, with my own eyes, seen planes that are invisible on my traffic map, and I think that is a disgrace. As a newer pilot, it makes me nervous to fly where the military flies. Okay? And we're going to leave that at that, and we're going to move on to more updates, because there's a lot to talk about here. All right, so that's our Potomac crash. Now, I want to talk about the hours that these pilots were flying, because a lot of folks are like, oh, was this? I see these comments on social media. People are like, oh, was the pilot like flying part-time, or why did they only have 500 hours of flight time? First of all, it takes a long time to get hours in aviation. You're lucky if you fly like 2 or 3 hours every day. First of all, there's weather. Second of all, there's ground that you have to learn, so you have to respect weather. There's ground schooling that you have to do. There is a lot that goes into prep and charting and plating. So you could literally spend a 10-hour day of studying aviation, ground, plates, your pre-flight checklist, fueling, sumping fuel, verifying your systems are functioning on the aircraft. And you spend 10 hours and you only end up logging 2.5 hours of flight time. It's happened to me many times. So when I say I have 150 hours, that's probably like 500 or more hours of actual aviation-related work. It could be even substantially more than that. So the hours are a little bit misleading, but it shows you when somebody has thousands of hours, they've been doing it for a while, because you're probably putting in about 3 to 4 hours for every actual hour of flight time you have. Kind of crazy. According to what we could see online, it appears that the female pilot had, here it says more than 450 hours of flight time. I've seen other sources that have indicated that she had 450 hours. Here it says more than 500 hours. Either way, it is on the lower side. Now, I realize I have fewer hours than that. I understand I've only been flying since November. But I will say the most experienced pilots usually have in excess of 5,000 hours. Certainly 2,000 hours in an aircraft. And usually what happens, and this is a big downside in aviation as well, is that as soon as you get to around 1,500 hours, you sort of graduate from training and being a trainer, and you start going on to flying jets or, a fighter pilot. You're getting out of the training environment. It's almost like once you get to 250 hours, you start training other people. You're still a total newbie, but you're training other people. And now, instead of you paying as like a private pilot, instead of you paying to fly to get those 250 hours, somebody else is paying you to train them, and you're getting hours because you're sitting in the plane collecting hours, right? Training to go from 250 to 1,000. So it's possible that this instructor with more than 1,000 hours of flight time, it's possible maybe they only had 500 hours themselves of actually flying and 500 hours of sitting in the chair next to the person learning. I think that is a critical downside, and really it's frankly a fatal flaw in the training environment in aviation. For example, I have been in situations where I'm doing instrument training, And like, imagine this, we're flying in the clouds. You know, if you're wondering about this, you're like, wait, instrument training, you probably should be flying in the clouds, right? Well, yeah, you should be. But most people who get their instrument ratings, they get their instrument rating with almost no actual flight time in clouds. Instead, they wear these things called a hood or foggles. These are the greatest scam ever. These are a total ripoff for the aviation community. I absolutely despise these. See, they're just supposed to like block the upper part of your vision so that way you can only look at the console in front of you. It's total fugazi. Now, why is it total fugazi? Because you could still see out of the corners of the glasses with your peripheral vision, or you lift your head a little bit and you could see everything in front of you in visual flight rules. I've worn foggles during the day, at night. I've worn them probably for somewhere around 40 hours. They're a scam. I've been in actual clouds for maybe about 90 minutes. And I'll tell you, when you're in actual clouds, like flying the plane yourself in the actual clouds, it is a completely different ballgame. The first time I went into the clouds, you know, it's like, oh, okay, I've done foggles. Should be similar, right? No. It's like, oh, whoa, okay, I literally can't see anything. I can't like take off the glasses and go, oh, I can see everything now. It is a freaky feeling. Now, this will be important when we talk about the Philadelphia crash, because it could be something that contributed to the Philadelphia crash. Speculation, we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I find that the vast majority of instrument training that is conducted in these sort of hoods or foggles, and they do not give a realistic impression of what it is like to be an instrument-rated pilot. I think that could be a contributor to why pilots aren't really good when it comes to clouds unless they have a lot of experience flying in the clouds. And I'm also of the opinion and mindset that people shouldn't become a pilot at all unless they're instrument rated. Now that adds extra barriers, and that's probably why we're not in this case, but it's very easy to take off in visual conditions, and then before you know it, you're in mist or a cloud, and that panic sets in of, oh my gosh, I can't see anything anymore. Now, as an instrument-rated pilot, you know, no problem. I got my instruments. I'm going to trust my instruments. But that adjustment does not actually get trained in most people's training. And I think that is bad. I don't know if that contributed at all to the Philadelphia crash. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But this idea that she had 500 hours and the instructor had 1,000 hours, yeah, they're both newer. There are some people like this website arguing that this was a very experienced group. I don't think 1,000 hours of flight time is very experienced. I've been in instrument conditions with pilots who have 1,000 hours, and they've never been in an icing condition. And then I think to myself, I'm like, how am I supposed to learn from somebody? And I don't blame them. I blame sort of like the schooling process, the way the aviation process is. How am I supposed to learn how to deal with icing if almost none of the instructors you fly with have ever been in icing themselves? Because they do their instrument training with foggles, and they're not actually in clouds where they're dealing with icing. You know, so like that way, if I'm in a situation where I'm like, okay, I know I need to turn on our anti-ice 15 minutes before entering icing, and we enter icing, and the system's not on yet because the instructors haven't been taught, and they say, no, we're going to preserve our icing fluid until we're actually in the clouds. I'm like, it's not going to work. And then that's what happens. That is unsafe. And that's not any one person's fault. I think it's just the nature of aviation is that you're training people in a way that it does not line up with reality. And that's probably, and again, this is speculation, that could be a contributor to what you have over here. When you go through and you read these FAA plates, and the FAA plates are, okay, we're gonna be at this altitude, at this level. How often have the pilots trained at night to be at those various different altitudes? My guess is not too often, because most training is also done during the day. I go out of my way to find training at night because I think it's so important to train at night. Everything is different. Illusions are different, especially if you're wearing night vision. Everything is different at night. I've never worn night vision, I'll say that. But that's another potential contributor here. Again, it all comes back to training. And I just want to be clear with where my opinion is and where the factual updates are. So, we know as a fact, ceilings are 200 in the Potomac crash. We know that radar data rounds to 100. The ceiling was 200. Let me make sure I said that right. And radar rounds to 100. We know there are cases as a fact that the military does not broadcast their location. And we know as a fact that oftentimes the people training don't have a lot of real world experience themselves. Those are facts. All of those facts are problems. We also know as a fact that landing is 6 times more dangerous than takeoff. I have flown a helicopter as well. And I'll tell you, it's really easy, without even realizing it, to add a tiny little bit of pressure to that lever that's on the floor. They call it the collective. It should be using my left hand. It's just the camera's on the right. But it's really easy to pull up on that without even noticing it and start climbing. Very easy to bust ceilings in a helicopter. Now, at this point, here you can see some indications of the 450 hours of experience. We see Captain Rebecca as clearly an enthusiast outdoors. She worked in the Biden administration. There were rumors circulating that, oh, she was LGBTQ. These sort of comments are just disgusting. I feel terrible that this happened. And again, I'm making this video because I feel so bad for these folks. They're literally my age. You know, I just turned 33. And it's so sad. Anyway, so this is why I want to add this insight to this. Now, going on to Philadelphia. The black box was recovered. The daughter was 11. Who died, which is absolutely terrible. It's so unfair. It's almost Final Destination-esque, where it's like you literally got life-saving surgery and to survive, to have a chance at life. And then the plane that's going to take you home after your life-saving surgery crashes. This is the black box. It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. Now, I froze. I didn't like a lot of the animations from AI Tele here either. So I froze at an image that I did like, which is, and I've sort of been leading up to this. I believe that the pilots, and this is my speculation, okay? Fact, I want to be clear. The fact is the girl was 11. The fact is one person died on the ground. I think they were in a car. Let's see here. Black box was recovered. The photo was released. Some of the cops are dealing with breathing problems. And here we go. One 37-year-old was found dead inside a vehicle after the plane crashed. 6 people inside of the plane, including her mother and 4 crew members, were all killed, all from Mexico. They had a fuel stop scheduled, but they were heading to, it looked like, Tijuana, Mexico. Now, the reason I froze on this image is because when we looked at the trajectory of this flight, which I didn't love the drawing of the trajectory here, mostly because how they're depicting this plane taking off from this plane, I think is a little, or taking off from the airport is a little funny. Like, at least put the flight path of the line on where the airport is. But anyway, the point is, they show a little bit of a right turn starting, which some of the ADS-B data did indicate a little bit of a right turn starting, but they were supposed to turn substantially to the right. 290 degrees was their supposed heading, which would have been about halfway through the screen over here, where this mouse is. So for some reason, they never completed this turn. Now we know that in the takeoff data, we hear them acknowledge their switch to the partner frequency, and then the pilot says, "Good day," which implies that there's no real stress at the point of that ATC transition, which is probably around the time that they entered the clouds. Now, again, that is speculation. It is speculation that they were not distressed because the pilot said good day, or the co-pilot said good day. But what we know is they never fully completed their right turn. Now, pilot debrief suggests that and Bronco Leary both suggest that this was unlikely a stall, but that this was potentially a result of spatial disorientation. I agree that there were two speculations I originally had. One was that this was either a stall or that this was spatial disorientation. It appears more likely after looking at more of the data that because of the way the plane crashed, spatial disorientation is what happened. Which, what I mentioned in my first video, is that when you are taking off, if you're not fully prepped, there's a lot that's going on. You, in my opinion, should have the autopilot set before your takeoff. Because when you get into the clouds like this, things change very, very rapidly. And this is where, as a newer pilot, I'd like to also mention that pilots, first of all, every plane should have an autopilot. A lot of trainer planes do not have autopilot, which is insanely stupid in my opinion. And again, I'm giving that to you as perspective. Fact, many trainer planes don't have autopilot. Now, if you drive a Tesla, you think, how hard is it to use autopilot? Well, I'll tell you, in a plane, very hard. Because if you get into a plane and you just turn on the autopilot on your takeoff, the first mode it goes into is called roll mode. Roll mode is like what it sounds. The plane's just going to start rolling into a constant bank. That's not what you want. That's like terrible. What you generally want on takeoff is your plane to follow a flight plan, which means the flight plan has to be programmed, or a heading. So what I like to do when I take off on a plane, assume this little radio here is a plane. When I take off on a plane, I like to have my autopilot set before I ever enter the runway. So I set my autopilot and I'll program in. I'll do the same thing every time. What is my initial heading going to be? Okay, I'm taking off runway 26. I want my initial heading to be 300. So I want to turn right 30 or 40 degrees. I rotate my heading knob to 300, set that heading. What altitude do I want to climb to? Set my altitude knob, move the altitude to 4,000 or whatever my initial climb altitude is. And then I got to set my flight level change. Okay, so I go to flight level change, and then I scroll the little wheel, and I program in at what speed do I want to climb. All right, I want to climb at 110 knots or 120 knots, whatever. Now, if you program that all, and then you went to test your flight controls, as pilots usually do, you could have actually overridden the autopilot and cleared all of those settings. So now all of a sudden you get up in the air, you hit the autopilot, and oh no, it's back on roll mode. It never actually saved all of the autopilot settings you input. So now you have to reprogram all of that, and if you're doing that as you're entering the clouds, good luck, man. I say this because as a newer pilot, I see a lot of training failures. Nobody has trained me how to set the autopilot before takeoff. That is something that I studied and started doing myself. And then when I do it, people that I fly with, trainers, are like, oh, that's a good idea. Like, bro, this should always be done. If you are fortunate enough to actually have a plane that has autopilot that you're training in. I'm fortunate. I've done most of my training hours in a Cirrus SR-22 G7, but it's very expensive to do that. Some of my training hours have been in Cessnas, in Pipers, or Diamonds, like a DA-42, and there's no autopilot. But when you go out into the real world and you start flying a plane with autopilot and you never had training on it, well, then you don't have the habits built to actually have your autopilot preset. See, in my opinion, and this is speculation, okay? So I want to give you the fact. Autopilot training sucks in aviation. And like nobody actually does preset this stuff, or they don't realize that their autopilot settings get cleared when they go through their checklist. So you have to set it at the correct time. But in addition to that, when you transition from training into the real world, and now you're expected to use autopilot, you're going in with sort of empty bags of training. And so when you go into the clouds, in my opinion, you want to be at a point where you're at 400 feet, boom, autopilot on. Like as soon as you've cleared your obstacles and you're off the end of that runway, the departure end of the runway, autopilot. I want that sucker on ASAP because there's enough going on. Now you have to dial in your departure frequency if you didn't preset that up. You got to put in your heading if you didn't preset that up. All of that could be on autopilot. In my opinion, and this is based on the data, autopilot was not used. Unless there was some kind of catastrophic failure, which I don't think there necessarily was. There were a lot of comments around this plane potentially being on fire prior to landing. I didn't see that in any of the images. What it looked like was a very bright landing light that would show up in some of the imagery, or just the reflection of the side of the plane. It's very, very common. When you fly a plane at night and you start seeing the reflections that pop up of other planes, that makes more sense, or the landing lights of planes. They're very bright. In my opinion, autopilot was not used. Otherwise, that heading would have been used unless there was some other in-flight catastrophic failure. So again, I want to be clear. There is a form of speculation here. But I want to use this as a learning opportunity to say, here is how that speculation could potentially, if it's not the cause of this crash, it could potentially be the cause of other crashes. And I'm bringing it up as a learning lesson because I see this as a big problem. So if autopilot was used, they would have had their heading, and they probably wouldn't have gotten spatially disoriented because the autopilot would have flown them to their heading and to their altitude, and they could have taken their time to get their bearings. Now here's the other thing. When you end up without autopilot on and you're stick flying in the clouds, yes, pilots are supposedly trained to be comfortable with this, but most of them are trained wearing foggles. When you actually hit the clouds, it's like, oh, I can't see anything. I have been in that situation where I hit the clouds, I look down, and I'm go, switch to instruments. You look down, and you feel your adrenaline because you're like, okay, I only have the instruments now, and you look down, gotta hold that heading, hold that altitude, how's my angle, how's my pitch, you know, everything. Attack for climbs. And this is also important because I also mentioned that I think a contributor to this crash, my opinion, is a weight issue. Very easy if you're full fuel to be overweight here. I don't know if they were full fuel, given that they had a fuel stop not too terribly far away. It is possible that they actually didn't have a full fuel, but you know, based on the explosion at the end, it seemed like there's a chance they could have been full fuel. We'll see. The investigation will reveal. But it's very, very easy if you are aft heavy, and then you get into the clouds and you get disoriented. You're accidentally pitching too high. You become disoriented, you lose directional control of the aircraft, and you start rolling to the left, which, as we saw in the data, is what happened, the roll to the left. We don't know why that roll to the left happened, but it could be a contributor. So, to me, these are all issues. But in addition to this, there are issues of ATC, or air traffic control, just being overwhelmed. This is another issue that I see a lot in aviation. And I hate to say it, but I think a lot of air traffic controllers are overwhelmed. There are probably too few of them, but I've seen air traffic controllers be unable to handle traffic callouts to where planes are taking off into other planes and they're not even noticing each other, and air traffic control says nothing. I'm not trying to make excuses, but I've been in situations where I just see air traffic control where you expect them to give a traffic advisory and they don't. Or and it's probably because they're overwhelmed with other work. I've also seen very inconsistent airport aids, landing aids out of service, precision approach landing lights out of service, pathway indicators like a PAPI, inconsistent weather briefings. You know, we still rely on these like ATIS reports that only update every hour, but weather changes way faster than that. Manual wind checks. The fact that we have to sometimes get on the radio and manually request a wind update is crazy, since the wind data is generally collected in an automated manner anyway. They should be just broadcast via an automated ATIS every minute, as some airports have, but not all airports. Military should never have ADS be disabled in America, especially around active civilian flight areas. We've talked about some of the training area issues or autopilot issues. I do think that air traffic control should verify that you're actually on your departure heading before transitioning you to the next controller. I mean, maybe that's just a responsibility division, but this aircraft, the Philadelphia aircraft, was clearly not on its 290 heading, and they just handed him off to the next controller. I'll let the next guy deal with it. Sort of the kick the can down the road mentality. Maybe that's what the procedure is for ATC. I don't think it's great. So these are thoughts that I have. In addition to, I also had a comment about how if an aircraft says, hey, I have another aircraft in sight, they should be reading back the tail number. Now then when I said that, I got comments from people that are like, but Kevin, how are you supposed to see the tiny number on the tail of a plane? Sorry. Bro, it's right here. It's right there. Okay, it's not that hard. So let's just say, as an example, I am November 53 Lima Echo. And air traffic control tells me you are number 3 to land, which means that's number 1, that's number 2, and that's number 3. It's not that hard for me to say, affirmative, number 3 to land, following November 66 215, 3 to land, November 53, Lima Echo. Something like that. Obviously, we could probably clean that up a little bit and people are like, yeah, it's too much congestion on the radio. Bro, I have been in situations mapped just like this, where I am in the Lima Echo position, and air traffic control says, you're number 3 to land. And I go, got it. You want me to follow 215? And they say, no, there's actually another aircraft, off the map over here to the right. I want you to follow that one. I'm like, well, good thing I checked. It's right there. It's not that hard. So, sorry. I'm frustrated because, again, as a newer pilot, I see this stuff and it drives me nuts. I'll give you another example just to show you. This is sort of like a bonus here. That parachute jump area you can see at the top there, literally seen this kind of stuff. I'll leave you with the little clip of the audio of it and some silly, janky, video editing around it that I did. But anyway, if you found this insight helpful, consider subscribing to the channel. Good luck out there. I really appreciate you all watching and subscribing to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one. Goodbye and good luck.
Point mover approach, Piper 2901 Alpha, at 10 o'clock, there's a parachute guy getting close to me.
2901 Alpha, are you up by frequency? Where are you?
Right now he's on my 9 o'clock. I am over Simi Valley. Well, this guy is having fun. I just want to let you know there's a parachute going on area. This guy is just jumping from somewhere, I don't know from where, but he's very close to me, probably a few miles.
Roger. How long have you been on our frequency?
I've called you about 5 minutes ago for fly following to Van Nuys.
Oh, excellent. You probably heard our jump call. We said there are parachute activities 5 miles northeast of Kimmer Airport. The next 5 minutes, 8,000 feet below. So you probably heard that call, and that jump zone is depicted on all VFR maps.
Yes, sir. I've been flying for 6 years and never witnessed something like this. I just wanted to let you know. Thank you.
For 6 years, you should know that jump zone is in Camarillo, just northeast of Camarillo, sir.
Sure. Thank you. 01 Alpha.
Thanks for the heads up. I'm sure they had a nice view of your airplane.
Can I get fly following to Van Nuys by any chance?
Okay, I'll be right now. Continue northeast. We'll help you in a moment.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.